We have to admit Australia is in rapid decline. Rapid. We are destroying the joint.
Ross Cameron has publicly apologised for what he said, and even though his intention was quite the opposite, as the context makes clear, he acknowledged he made a poor choice of words.
What still drives you to do what you do with kind of the controversies and the stuff that you've actually been through?
Yeah, well, if we're going to talk about things Ross has been sacked from, we could...
Ross Cameron is an Australian politician who served as a Liberal Party member in the Australian House of Representatives for Parramatta from 1996 to 2004.
He served as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer during his political career, and he later transitioned to roles in investment banking and as a media host on Sky News, currently serving as the President of the New South Wales Libertarian Party.
Why is it that the 4 Australian banks have got the highest return on equity of any banks in the world? The reason is because...
Is it that the debt has gotten so great, or the division between rich and poor? Like, what's leading to the decay?
I would go back a bit further. You see, when...
Is what you're saying that the people of Australia aren't believing in the actual country anymore?
Yeah. It's kind of a white guy's disease globally, where we have been, I think...
This was a very interesting podcast. The first 30 to 40 minutes, Honorable Ross Cameron took us down a little bit of history. And I don't want anyone to get lost because he's not just saying it to say it. He's saying it because it really intertwines with what we discuss in the last hour of the podcast. For those of you guys that are listening, listen very, very, very carefully, because the last 40 to 50 minutes of this podcast really hits home. It really hit home to me, and I wanted to hit home to you guys as well. So keep listening. Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of the Unemployable podcast. Today we have another political pod on our hands, and we have someone very, very special that has joined us, who's flown up from Sydney to be here today. It's the Honorable Ross Cameron. How are you, Ross?
Couldn't be better.
Yeah, good. Thanks for coming on. And James, thank you for being here. Mark, as usual.
Ready for some fireworks?
For those of you guys that don't know who the Honorable Ross Cameron is, he's an Australian politician, former member of the House of Representatives, representing the seat of Parramatta in the Liberal Party under John Howard from 1996 to 2004. He got re-elected twice in that time, in 1998 and 2001. So we've been having a lot of people that have been coming on the pod that have been trying to get into Parliament. But what's great about your story is that you've actually had this seat there. So I can't wait to break that down. And in 2003 and 2004, he worked in the Treasury under the Treasurer, Peter Costello. And some of you guys might see a familiar face because he was a co-host on the political talk shows and co-hosted them on Sky News, the Contrarians and the Outsiders. And now he's part of the Libertarian Party. So I guess I'd like to open up by asking, I guess you've had a quite unconventional journey in the past, right? You've obviously went from Parliament to primetime TV, and you basically got removed from both. So I guess really, what still drives you to do what you do with kind of the controversies and the stuff that you've actually been through? Because I take my hat off to people like you that just keep persevering in this political roadshow.
Yeah, well, if we're going to talk about things Ross has been sacked from, we could add to the list if you wanted to. I got sacked from the Liberal Party for something I said on Sky News. And it was a case of, the Liberal Party, allegedly the bastion of free speech and freedom of opinion. But if you just cross that line, you're out the door, sunshine. But this is a very ancient story. Indeed, as a libertarian now, where I sort of went as a refugee, as a homeless outcast and exile, we revere, among others, John Stuart Mill, the sort of Scottish, English philosopher of the 19th century who wrote the book On Liberty. And Mill says, Mill was a very extraordinary individual and with a very extraordinary education, who began his first language he learned was ancient Greek from the age of 3, learnt Latin from 8. But he says in On Liberty that the single most consistent and conspicuous feature of the portions of history is the struggle between liberty and authority. And what you find is that the opposition loves freedom of speech and the government hates it. But very often when the parties swap around, the same thing is true.
What's that saying? Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah.
Something like that. It's
Yeah.
like, so
And there's a sense in which, we can, if we can drill down to the very personal level, how well do you receive criticism? Probably all of us fall somewhere on a spectrum, and we get criticism from people who love us, which we tend to respond to more sympathetically, criticism from people who intensely dislike us, but the criticism may be equally valid, and it's in our interests to be open to hearing it. But there is this human, arguably, it's probably a very ancient survival reflex to believe our own story. And indeed, I would say as a political candidate, the first thing you need is to believe your own story. If you stop believing your own story, you don't have very much to offer. And I would say, if the Unemployable podcast said to me, well, what do you think is Australia's biggest problem?
I was just about to ask that exact question.
Good.
Do you think that's Australia's biggest problem?
You could define it a range of different ways, but I think loss of belief in our own story is arguably, that could be the number one.
What do you mean by that, loss of belief in your own story as a country? I can see loss of belief when you think of it individually, like yourself, right? Running for a seat. If you don't believe in yourself, how are you going to have anyone else believe in you? So is what you're saying that the people of Australia aren't believing in the actual country anymore?
Yeah.
Sorry, didn't see you there. While you're here, actually, we've got a new coaching cohort that just opened up for the Unemployable Property Coaching Program, that you get taught on how to become a property developer. One-on-one coaching, bi-monthly coaching, and also events where we get a full coach bus with all the students and go to 6-7 different development sites. When I say development sites, from 1 lot to 10 lots to 50 lots. So you get to see exactly why we buy it, how we buy it, how we fund it, and also how you can do it yourself. The next day, we had an amazing event at the QT Hotel here on the Gold Coast, where we had all of our consultants come in and teach everybody on what they're looking for with sites, what are the different trends, and how you can become a property developer yourself. Now you see me on the video, but who you're gonna be getting coached by is Shannon and Carson. Who's Shannon and Carson? 4 years ago, Carson was cleaning carpets. Shannon was a machine operator. Today, they're doing over $100 million worth of land deals. I know you're listening, and I know you want to take action. And if that's you, click on the link below or go to www.unemployableproperty.com.au and register your interest, and one of our team will reach out to you, and we'll see you on the next bus. Now get out of here.
Yeah. I would say it's kind of a white guy's disease globally, where we have been, I think, sort of cowed and intimidated into a shame narrative about our culture at a time when the cultures around us, see, people, there's a lot of criticism of China. And I had a pretty spirited discussion with my Uber driver on the way over to the Unemployable's beautiful studio, where Tom has done a magnificent job with the cameras and the
Plenty of
audio,
cameras on you.
about China. But, the principal difference, I would say, between China and Australia is that China still believes their story. And, you know, it's very interesting that the question of the way in which civilizations or tribes, nations rise and fall. It's obviously been the subject of a fair bit of historical study by some very fine minds. Obviously, the most Edward Gibbon Jr., who wrote the fall of the Roman Empire. A guy named David Hume is a Scottish philosopher, one of my favourites. Naturally, Edinburgh University had a building named after David Hume, who wrote a number of very significant works of philosophy. He was one of the earliest pioneers in consciousness. Where does your perception and opinions come from? But he also wrote the history of England from the invasion of Julius Caesar until 1688. So he was a guy with a very long perspective of history. I was going to say, naturally, Edinburgh University, which had named one of its residential colleges after David Hume, some of their students got together and said, he was not sufficiently opposed to slavery. So they've got out that bloody chisel and chiseled his name off the building, right? The most significant humanitarian figure in the Scottish Enlightenment, and Edinburgh University can't have his name on a building. And this is the story of the Anglosphere, that we have lost self-belief. But the point about David Hume is he also wrote an essay called The History of the Progress of the Arts and Sciences. And he looks at why it is that you get this sort of slow growth, bubbling, and then sort of effulgence, this sort of explosion of creativity in some cities and cultures. So we had it first with, maybe in the Indus Valley, then in Samaria. You had it in, in Crete with the Minoans for some reason. You had this flowering that took place in Egypt and in Babylon. And, in the modern world, we saw, the Italian Renaissance Reformation. You see, Venice, London, Edinburgh for a period. Why is it? And this was the question that Hume was asking, that why is it that you see this flourishing in some places, but not at all in others, and then this apparent slide? And Hume makes the observation as a very long-term historian. He says that there's a number of factors that must be present in order for this blossoming and flourishing to take place. But he says once the decline begins, there are very few examples of it being turned around.
So with that, just if we go back to the layman, you're saying believe in yourself, and then Australia sort of lost belief in itself as a country. What did we used to believe in as a country, and when did this belief start to erode, and then where's it headed, and what's the based on history, what's the antidote or the fix?
Oh, simple questions,
And not laid upon each other. I mean, nothing,
You just took my next 4 questions in one. So.
Yeah. Well, if we take them seriatim, the first one, what did we believe?
Yeah, and when?
And so, we'll say, well, for about 40,000 years, those occupying the continent, which came to be known as Terra Australis, Espiritu Sanctus, the great south land of the Holy Spirit. For a long time, there was for centuries, there was a lot of speculation that this great southern continent existed, but nobody had really been able to find it or draw a line around it, except for the several waves, we think probably 3 waves of Aboriginal occupants who basically came in and a mixture of wiped each other out and assimilated in now that with the unraveling the resolution of the human genome, we're able to now start following the different waves of migration that took place. And if we wanted to be, needlessly controversial, which we don't, we can have an argument about who are the first peoples of this continent. Are the ones here now, are they actually the first peoples, or are the ones who wiped out the first peoples?
Right.
But they certainly, I'm grateful to the Australian Indigenous because they wiped out the megafauna. And when they arrived, Australia had, we had sort of 20 species, big vertebrates, above 60 kilos.
Mammoths? Is that what they were referred to? Or?
Well, there were multiple different kinds. We had an amphibious crocodile that would grow to, sort of 8-10 meters long. We had, things that would make the monitor lizard just looked like a little garden glass box lizard on we had a saber-toothed kangaroo, carnivorous. We had a whole bunch of absolutely lethal species of megafauna that lived by killing things like human beings. And we don't have them now. There's a little bit of argument about it in the literature among scholars about whether they died by, climate change, where everyone's desperate to avoid the conclusion that the extinction of the megafauna and the arrival of hominids, Homo sapiens, Aboriginals,
Same time.
it was at the same time. And obviously we weren't there to document it. The Unemployables weren't there with Tom and 10 cameras. So we don't know exactly how it happened, but it appears that the hominids wiped out the megafauna. So if you say to me, James, well, what did we used to think about ourselves? Well, for the first 40,000 years of human occupation of the continent, we had a range of beliefs, but they were fairly, while there were significant differences across clans and tribes around the country in very relatively small populations of tribal groups of between about a dozen and, up to mobs of maybe 30 or 40, who were completely existence, hunter-gatherers. The argument that there was sort of agricultures or serious, there was spearing fish. There was no fishery. And they became, by their isolation from the rest of the world, both sort of genetically and culturally, arguably the most distinct human cohort on the planet. And this, of course, is why we had such a collision when the Europeans finally arrived. There's a little island, there's a little place in the Andaman Islands, I think, come to me in a minute, a tiny island grouping that have effectively never been exposed to Western people. They've had one missionary who rocked up and got speared. I think 2 blokes have rolled up, both got speared. And their whole thing is, we want no contact with the rest of the world. And for Aboriginal Australians, for 40,000 years, that was the deal by necessity. They were, in a sense, making a choice. They had managed to get there across a land bridge through Timor, Papua New Guinea, etc. They had effectively walked down, but then the water rose and they were separated. And
Wow.
But if you say, what did they believe? And this is one of the issues. There's an absolutely beautiful, and I think one of the most reliable statements of what they believed can be found in the story of William Buckley, from whom we get the Australian expression Buckley's chance. I don't know, Eric, if you're familiar with this
I'm not that
expression.
one.
No, I thought it might be
Water
just-
off a duck's back is what I'm learning lately.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's where
But-
I'm at.
it's Buckley's. If somebody says to you in the pub,
Buckley's, mate.
I think if you're before the dartboard saying, I reckon I can
Oh yes,
whack
I've
this
heard
in the
this.
20, and a guy says, mate, you've got Buckley's.
Yeah.
Another variant of it is you've got none and Buckley's. When you've got no chance and you've got Buckley's chance. And Buckley's chance comes from which means a very, very slim, not impossible, but very, very small and remote chance. And Buckley was a very, very interesting guy. He was English, very tall. He was about 6'6", but he was sent to Australia as a convict for stealing. Allegedly, it looks like he was acting as a fence, stole a bolt of wool. And he later basically admits to it. But he was in the Royal Navy, and he had a little tattoo which becomes significant later in the story. But he got transported, and he went to the first attempt to establish a colony in Victoria. And they had pulled up there on the ship. It was just one ship, and it was only about, maybe a couple. I think there was only a couple of dozen convicts on the ship, and they got off and they pulled up on land. And after they'd been there for a couple of days, they could not find fresh water or food, and the natives were hostile. And so the captain of the ship made a decision they were going to pull out and announced to everyone, prepare to pack up. We're going to go look somewhere else. The convicts realised if they were ever going to escape, this would be the moment to do it, right? Because the guys were leaving and not coming back. And so 4 of them decided to escape. And the first 2, after 24 hours in the Australian bush, struggling, to find water and food. And after 24 hours, they said, no, we're going to go back, hand ourselves in and take a punishment, whatever that may be. The third one went for, I think, another 24 hours. They had acted on the false assumption that Sydney was 100 miles north, and they didn't realise it was 1,000 kilometres. But Buckley, 3 went back, and Buckley kept going. And he then, by an extraordinary sequence of events, was adopted by an Aboriginal tribe.
Something you see in movies, isn't
Yeah.
it?
I can't believe nobody has made this movie. It's maybe Unemployable should, you guys, the entrepreneurs, maybe we should do it together. The point is, and it's such a fascinating story, I'm at risk of being, but we're not under too much time pressure, are we? I mean, I will tell you the key moment, that Buckley was walking up the coast and his sole source of protein was oysters. And he was just smashing the oysters on the rock and living on oysters, which is actually a really beautiful source of protein in a range of ways. If you fast, for example, what you really should do is fast but just have a dozen oysters, right? Because it gives you the potassium, magnesium, a range of the other critical things you need, but salt. But the point is, he swam across, he was going to sleep one night and he found a recent burial mound. And next to the burial mound was a spear. And he didn't understand its significance at the time, but the mound was sort of fresh and soft, and he slept next to it. And in the morning he got up and the spear was there, and he thought, well, I might need this spear, so he took it with him. And he swam across a river, and this was one of his biggest problems in traveling north, is that he had to get across these quite wide river mouths, He swam across, he nearly drowned, got out, carrying the spear, got out on the other side, basically just collapsed on the sand. And then a group of Aboriginal women came and found him there, because they had never seen a white guy before. And he's there, and he's carrying the spear of what turns out to be a warrior who was related to their clan, who had just been killed in battle and buried. And he was also a very big guy. And so they found this they'd never seen a white man. They assumed that he was the reincarnation of the dead guy.
Wow.
a godlike figure.
Some mythology. Right?
And so they then went into a kind of hysterical trance, took him back to the tribe, and the tribe all saw him as the reincarnation of the dead guy, and they embraced him. And he stayed with that tribe for 34 years. And he became so completely Aboriginal that by the time he came back into contact with a British ship, which had landed essentially trying to do the same thing, he had completely forgotten how to speak English. And he was talking to, but he knew that the guys who were greeting this ship which had just arrived were sitting around at night figuring out how they were going to murder everyone on the ship and take whatever they could find. And he then acted as a kind of a peace broker between the two. And interestingly, and he was showing them his Navy tattoo. By then, he hadn't shaven for 30 years. He was living in the sun, almost blackened, right? But he couldn't speak English until they gave him a piece of bread. And he obviously hadn't eaten bread for 3 decades. And as he ate the piece of bread, his language returned. But anyway, Buckley, if you read his book, he was subsequently pardoned because of his role, in particular, in helping to negotiate a truce. He then went to Melbourne and retired in Hobart. And while he was in Hobart, at the pub, telling his story, this journalist said, somebody must write down this story for. So he sat and interviewed him, and he wrote the story, The Extraordinary Adventures of Escaped Convict William Buckley, which you can get. You can put it up on a link on the podcast. Buckley makes the observation that while he came to really love his kin and his tribe, his single biggest problem with him that he could never really reconcile was the levels of violence taking place both within the tribes and between the tribes. And if you want to understand what was the Australian mindset in 1000 BC, or even say 1800 in most of Australia, the Indigenous belief virtually around the country was they did not have a concept of somebody dying of natural causes. They believed that if you died, you did so because somebody had put a spell on you. And they also believed that spell had to be avenged. And so this created an engine of tit-for-tat violence between the tribes. The second problem they had was that girls were given away in marriage as infants. And then what happened, and Buckley makes this observation, that very often or nearly always the violence that took place was around possession of the female. And the girls would sort of wind up hitting, 12, 13, 14, and develop attachments to a boy who was not their betrothed husband, would go off together, and then this would be the source of violence. And Buckley recounts on one occasion a girl in the tribe having been taken off by a boy from another tribe, and the relatives followed them, found them together in the knife, and took the spear and plunged it through both of them into the earth. And
It's Aussie version of Romeo and Juliet.
yeah.
Is this where we're getting back to in this century?
Yeah. But this thing of giving the girls away at birth and then them getting into complicated relationships and then that having to be meant this was a second layer of violence within the culture. And then finally, the Aboriginal women, according to Buckley, all carried the club. And and he was protected from the violence because he was this special person in the tribe. But he said absolutely routinely whoever, the neighbouring, there would be some basis of dispute which would bring them into contact. The most common form of interaction was the smashing over the head with the club, with both the males and the females participating equally enthusiastically. And so even today, where we find, if you go to Darwin Base Hospital, the figures people don't really like to talk about is that Aboriginal women are admitted to Aboriginal Base Hospital with cranial fractures at more than 90 times the national average. Now, Aboriginal men are going with cranial fractures pretty bloody often as well, but the point is this is actually a very, very old and ancient problem. So I just say to you, that's what was going on for 40,000 years. Then we can start talking about what happened after that.
I think just on that, I think a lot of people forget that, like, we're I don't know, I don't want to say soft, but we are very quick to jump on people for certain things, jokes, whatever it might be, comments. And these days we we talk about safety and things like that. But for the majority of history, like, this story isn't unique to the Great Southern Land. The Mongolians, like it's everywhere. The Roman Empire, the Greeks, like our history as a civilization has just been war and violence. And then you have World War I, World War II, and then since then there's been this abnormal peace dividend or period of prolonged peace.
Yeah.
And there's still violence in Syria and in the Middle East and things like that. But it's not even close. It's by far the most safe time in history. So I'm sure that you're about to now come present day, but it's just it is crazy to me sometimes that how harsh we are. Like, it's unfortunately, I don't know if people want to admit it, but it's in human nature to be really, really violent.
Yes, well, this is your observation is absolutely right.
You're carrying a club mark in your car, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. They talk about the police being, quote, the thin blue line between, civility and barbarism. Regrettably, in Australia over the last few years, the police became the barbarians. But, the human being tends to be, not that far away from the mob. And we see even online, where the violence may not be physical, there is still, the mob. It is sometimes said that prostitution is the most ancient institution, but I suspect the mob predates anything. And, we are still mammals. We are Homo sapiens sapiens, which means something. What does the sapien mean in Homo sapien? But we are still mammals. And, Don Draper said that every seduction ends with an assault. And he's kind of, there's a sense in which we don't somehow, by consciousness, transcend our corporeal, physical, animal nature. We are still an animal. And indeed, when I said to my 12-year-old daughter, please use a knife and fork because you are not an animal. And she said to me, well, Dad, actually, I am an animal. And so are you. And I had to say, don't answer back, because there's no freedom of speech in this household. But the point is, you're dead right. And a guy like, for example, Steven Pinker, who was the great...
Our angels of our nature.
Yeah. And an historian of violence, indeed, he says that the Papua New Guinea Highlander, the Australian Aboriginal, are, in historical terms, the most violent of all. But let's be honest and say we're all on this. We're all there on the spectrum, and indeed, the Australian Aboriginal, leader might turn to me and say, "Well, you say I'm violent, but I didn't drop bombs on Syria, on Ukraine, on Afghanistan, on Libya. And, NATO is arguably, in my opinion, probably the only tribe which is more violent than the Australian Aboriginal and the Papua New Guinea Highlander. But we're all capable of it.
So is that the thing? Is that what's happening? Are we just getting back to a cycle of violence? Is it debt? Is it that the debt has gotten so great, or the division between rich and poor? Like what's leading to the decay?
Yeah, in more recent times, and
in Australia.
appreciate the full context. But yeah,
Well-
it has been 20 years ago, 10 years ago when communities started to break down in what you're.
I'd say
proposing?
I would go back a bit further to, you see, when the Europeans came to Australia, I have described it as an Enlightenment project. It was a project that was filled with self-belief. And while we may now, looking back, argue about the merits of the belief system, there's no question that a guy like Joseph Banks, for example, who became really a hugely significant figure in the decision to create a permanent colony in New South Wales, and he was the president of the Royal Society, a very great, close personal friend of the King, and a passionate advocate for a British colony in Australia. But these guys, there was a lot in the internal communication. This was not some sort of a genocidal go and destroy the Aboriginals. The early governors, European governors in Australia, were very pro doing it as peacefully as we possibly can, even though it was always going to be a major confrontation. But they had the idea, for example, in relation to the convicts, they see the convicts in these hulks on the Thames after the UK had lost the American War of Independence, and so their opportunity to dump their convicts there had finished, in much the same way that Australia didn't have a problem with its recycling and rubbish until China said, okay, we've decided we're no longer going to be the world's rubbish dump. You've got to take care of your own. And we got absolutely no idea what to do with it. The idea was very significantly that if you could take the convict and give him or her a chance of redemption and the chance to own land, that was a significantly better humanitarian result than leaving them there in a hulk on the Thames. And, likewise, I would say the belief in the British Empire at its best, while I have fallen out of love with Britain, I hate to say it, as somebody who did love Britain, I no longer do. The 18th century idealism, you get a guy, Elizabethan England is described by, there was a guy who won, Will Durant, won a Pulitzer.
I just ordered those books.
Did you?
11 volume
Yeah,
series.
yeah. So Will and his crazy, smart wife, Ariel, classic sort of Jewish, crazy genius chick, wrote these volumes together, the Civilizations, where they
History of Civilization.
Yeah. And Will says that Elizabethan England was really the greatest epoch of the greatest nation, ever, essentially. And it was just this period of extraordinary self-belief built around a combination of the sort of Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment principles, and guys like, Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus, who wrote a poem imagining the Sydney Harbour Bridge as this golden span, over the Sydney Harbour. And you had guys like Josiah Wedgwood, the potter, but also a humanist, a philanthropist, and a believer that we could take the greatest results of the sort of Enlightenment and carry it to the rest of the world. In the same way, Alexander the Great, was really trying to export Greek ideas to the rest of the world, and was quite successful at doing so. And that early Enlightenment project was just absolutely filled with self-belief. Then I would say the First World War was the thing that really punched a hole in Western sort of liberal Anglo self-belief, because it was, in effect, a European civil war. And it was a complete failure of leadership, but and there was a sense in which nobody really knew what it was about. And there are quite a few sort of war diaries of the private, on the traipsing 10 kilometres between one bivouac and the next, and talking to each other, saying, "What are we actually fighting for? What is this about?" And the death which followed of sort of wiping out the cream of a generation, for no apparent reason, just because at the level of the state, with its connection to the military-industrial complex, you're always just not that far away from a massive conflagration where the humanizing, sapient, rational reflexes of the organism are just dissolved in moments of hate, revenge, retribution, and violence. And once they begin, they're very hard to predict and control, and they can tend to just, as a simple border dispute, which is really what Ukraine is about, just snowballs out of control in this combustible, mob-based reactions. And that's what happened. And we kind of came out of the First World War and with a loss of confidence in the state, and I think in many cases a loss of confidence in God, loss of confidence in the fundamental belief systems on which you'd had the rise of science and industrialism alongside a sort of Judeo-Christian story, which emphasized truth, which emphasized reason, which emphasized the importance of nature, and suddenly it was just smashed. So then then this century, the failure to make a rational, plausible, sustainable peace after the First World War gave rise to this intensity of desire for vindication and restoration, particularly with the rise of National Socialism in Germany. And so then we went bang and just repeated the whole cycle for a second time and wiped out another generation of, in what, in my judgment, was an avoidable war, because we took a vindictive, really sort of punitive approach to punishment in the First World War. We produced the seeds for the Second World War. And so then we came out of that more fully disillusioned. We went into a kind of a protest sort of rock and roll generation. And then, notwithstanding the fact that the Berlin Wall came down in sort of 1990, and we thought, well, the East-West Cold War is over and the West has won and capitalism has won and private property has won, the left just entirely turned the cannons. Instead of it being the Soviets versus sort of an Anglo alliance, it became the left managerial estate versus the citizens in a kind of internal coup d'etat, which is what we've been watching in particular over the last 3 decades.
Fast forward to today and where Australia is at right now, like speaking to the average Australian that's listening to this, right? Where has, I guess, where has Australia fallen as a country? Because there's a lot of unhappy people. There's a lot of happy people. I've been here 18 years, and Australia has been very, very good to me. It's been very good to my family. And I don't remember people being this upset, right? I don't remember people leaving the country because they're not happy with leadership. They're not happy with their, the cost of living, with their financial standpoint on where they're at now. What does Australia need to do, in your opinion, to build that belief back up in their people today?
Well, there are certain things that inflicted on us by others, which need to be remedied, repealed, reformed, removed. And then there are certain things which are within our own influence and control. I would say that long term, any culture, any tribe which cannot reproduce itself is obviously mathematically finished.
It's the Western world at the moment.
It's just a question of how long. You project the algorithm and you can sort of pick the date at which the last boy looks at the last girl and she says, you make me feel uncomfortable and I'm reporting you to HR. And then they drift off and that's the end of the human race. And that's sort of the direction we're going in.
Is that intentional? You put your conspiracy hat theory on? Like there's people out there that say that it's the depopulation conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
Like, is it an intentional signaling?
Yeah. Look, interesting question of what kind of rabbit hole is each of us happy to go down in relation. I mean, I've got a number of people in my world who are very, very and increasingly skeptical that humans ever landed on the moon. But this one is, I think, a very, very interesting question. Is it intentional? And if you were to say, if you go ahead and read most our sort of mainstream newspapers, essentially they're becoming a sexual allegation reporting gazette. And the objective, the levels of enforced, the landmines being set up around what I would prefer to call natural mammal interactions.
Or even free speech.
But I mean, I see you have got an ABC producer reported today who has just sent a memo to all staff under his direction saying that other producers should not give feedback to on-air talent in relation to their hair, makeup, or their broadcast voice. When we had sort of assumed that was one of the jobs of the producer, is to give feedback on hair, makeup, and broadcast. But because the talent might feel uncomfortable, and it was Malcolm and Lucy Turnbull who's introduced the sort of the so-called quote bonking ban into the Commonwealth Public Service, saying you may not have intimate relationships with other people you work for, because we, the sort of the muftis, the mullahs have decreed, the morality police have said that your employment obligations must supersede and transcend any other human attraction, interaction, affection you may have. And this sort of self-appointment of the state as the morality guardians, but all of it if we say what is at the top of the totem of beliefs of, what some might call the state, some might call the deep state, some might call the swamp, some might call the insider, managerial bureaucratic laptop class. I would say sterility in its various forms is very, very high, on the list. We could talk about climate change.
I just like appreciate the intelligence you have around the history, because I didn't know most of that. And again, I'm not big on researching history. It looks like I probably should be a little bit more, but majority of the people aren't even educated in today's times, never mind 40,000 years ago. And Unemployable has been created to kind of educate them on, their kind of wealth creation, entrepreneurial journey. And I look back at what you're saying of 40,000 years of this kind of these barbaric times, and then I fast forward to today, and it couldn't be any more different. And I'm not saying that we should be barbaric today, but I feel like one word comes to mind when I think of today's culture, Western world, and at times even myself, right? And you guys probably all think this about yourselves at some point, being vulnerable, is we're all becoming very soft. And I think this is one of the big issues.
I don't even know if it's soft. It's almost
soft.
It's almost like
You can't tell someone
no, but it's
constructive criticism.
but
You
it's
can't speak about certain. If I say certain thing, we can't talk about certain things on this podcast.
but it's all but it's almost, it's not that we've become soft. It's that everything we do, I don't know what the word to describe it is, but it's like we're being shamed for every single action. So it's not necessarily that people are becoming soft. They just prefer not to be shamed for speaking out, so they don't speak
so
out.
they don't have the spotlight on them.
Yeah, because it's like you can't, tall poppy syndrome, etc. It's like you can't stick your head out, or you're going to get it torn off, especially here. And I think it takes a lot of guts for anyone out there that's either coming on a podcast and being interviewed, or doing a podcast, to do a podcast, because there's so many. Like, I had someone on my Instagram message me saying, "Oh, I don't mind, but I'm just letting you know, I was surprised that what you said got through editing, because it might land you in hot water, but I don't mind." And it's kind of like have we changed as humans? It's like we used to kill and spear and beat people with a stick, but now we're fucking doing it with words over the internet. We're still doing it.
Before you
We're
used
not
to.
okay. There's a difference between killing someone, but we're still
Assassinating them characterly.
we're assassinating people
Well,
with different weapons
but-
these days.
Yeah, but you have to ask to do so. This is what I mean. Like back in the day, right? You would just do what you needed to do. Today, it's like, hey, is it okay if I do this? Is it okay if I give you some constructive criticism? Like, you have to ask to give it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I feel like, again,
My question is, why is it happening?
like I think we're changing as humans a little bit. Like, I look at myself, I look at my kids as an example, and they're 12 and 9, and I look at what they can do and what we make them do as parents today in regards to chores around the house and just everyday living, and it's nowhere near what it should be, in my opinion. Right? Like, and everyone is raised differently, that's fine, but I think it's just like there's so many rights now. There's so many I don't even know how to explain it. There's just so many things that are being put in place now that we can't sit there and have constructive conversations about a topic. Like, again, before we start every podcast, right, is what's on topic, what's off topic. It shouldn't even be a question, right? In my opinion, shouldn't even be a question. If we've all made the decisions that we've made, we should be able to discuss it amongst the panel, right? But some people are more uncomfortable than others. And again, like you said prior, nothing's off topic, right? So Mr. Cameron's come on here and said, hey, nothing's off topic, whatever you want to talk about. But
Is it a reaction to social media as well? Like back in the day, you could have a conversation with your mates, make a crude joke or whatever, and that's where it stayed in the backyard. Whereas now, everything is happening live to 8 billion people. And is it some sort of reaction to social media and everything
Well,
being
I
forecast?
mean, Ross is a perfect example. The guy used to be in Parliament
And-
for one of the major parties, and he got ousted. He then was on primetime talk show TV, said the wrong thing, did the wrong thing, got ousted. See you later. Then he falls off the face of the earth. You know what I mean? Like then all of a sudden, no one knows who you are. Like, how does that make you feel? Where do you see this going moving forward? Because even with the Unemployable podcast, at times the people that we bring on here and the things that we talk about, right? It is not my opinion. It's just constructive, talk in regards to everyone's history and experience. And at times I'm even like, oof, man, I don't know if, that's a pretty heavy topic, or that's a pretty, what he said was
So in short, what's fucked it up and what's the solution?
Yeah, well, I think it's a combination of one. If I want to make a partisan political point about, quote, the left, one of the reasons why I am on the right, okay, is that the right believes in the capacity of the individual to create. As an entrepreneur, for example, to build assets, to participate as an individual. And therefore, the right emphasizes the importance of private property, of free speech, thought, opinion, those things required to create. Whereas I would say the left have realized there is an element of human nature which is attracted to the status of being the victim of an unjust external force of some kind. And so the business
They're usually the more violent. If you go back and look at history, they're the ones that go and mass assassinate
yeah.
civilizations.
Yeah. And so what the left, if you're Penny Wong, Albo, the Greens, whatever, what they are looking around for is the person who is vulnerable to the message that you have suffered a really serious injustice. You have a right to be angry about the way that you have been treated. There is a systemic problem which is causing you to have these various outcomes in your life. The odds are stacked against you, and you need a way to fight back, and that is to vote for the Greens, because we're going to create climate justice for you. Okay. Now, that permanent sharpening of grievance is enervating. Okay, it means it sucks the energy out of the culture. It sucks self-belief out of the individual. And so you've got all these kids, who have go through, and I would say education. It was a massive, massive mistake of the Howard government when Brendan Nelson was the minister. Half of the stupid ideas come from the Liberal Party. And this was one of the stupid ideas from the Liberal Party, was to create a national education curriculum. And so that just meant you could concentrate all of the feminist, Marxist, sort of trans community into one government department and shove it down the throats of the whole nation instead of only one state at a time. And so you get kids who are constantly told to fear the imposition of, inappropriate words or thoughts or behaviour from others, and to, that you're in a permanent state of resistance against this imagined injustice. And I think that's a part of it. Then in Australia, you get legislation, and, you find this completely dodgy, fake, caravan story in Sydney. They find a caravan which has apparently been left there for days, which has got a few unexploded 40-year-old, bombs inside it, and a list of residents of Jewish synagogues. And so therefore we have to have a whole brand new hate speech legislation introduced to the New South Wales Parliament, which is going to very closely regulate what you say. Then you have bills like misinformation and built on ideas like misinformation and disinformation, which are entirely subjective and built on the principle of offence. That if you cause offence, you are guilty potentially of a crime. When, you know, when offence is taken, not given, it's an entirely subjective response to a fact. I basically never take offence, right, as a policy decision. And so I would say, in answer to your question, James, one of the things we have to do is roll back the bureaucracy of the nanny state, presuming to be able to look into the human heart and say, well, that sentence reflects the fact that, you know, Mark had hate in his heart, as if I know what was in your heart. That's that whole edifice and machine has got to be rolled back. And some will say, well, that's never going to happen. I'd say, well, in Argentina right now, it's happening. Multiple government departments have been completely abolished by Javier Milei, and the Argentine economy is going through a massive bounce back. So we libertarians hope that the libertarian virus of Argentina will become infectious and we'll catch it here in Australia.
And I guess that's the point I was trying to make. It's legal warfare, but it's a kind of warfare for control,
Yeah.
right? And it's like we've replaced the spears with a different type of warfare to maintain control.
I just think, like, I'm going to read an article, a part of an article, right? And I never seen these articles before. And this is where I see we have a major problem in this country, right? By reading these articles. And the article is called "We're Done," right? That was the first two words is "We're done." And then, you know, huge call about living in Australia. And I'm just going to, you know, these are well-to-do people.
What's crazy too, Eric, while you scroll through and find that, is it's not just the left that are creating those articles. Like even Adam, who's left, is saying things. He would say he's on the right, is saying similar types of things about Australia. Yeah. It's kind of like this thing that's infected both.
Well, as Shumlo said, there's two cheeks of the same ass, effectively.
Well, the thing is, like, and again, I don't want this podcast to become a Australia bashing podcast, right? Because this is just education, right? And unfortunately, people feel this way. Some of the feedback that we've been getting, right, off camera is like, hey guys, just, you know, I feel like you're, you know, attacking Australia, and Australia is an amazing and like I say, Australia has done amazing things for me and my family and the people on this podcast. But at times when there's articles like this that are coming out on a, you know, weekly, monthly basis now, these never used to be articles. I don't remember seeing these types of articles, right? And basically this one, right? I'm done. And it's a family that's leaving, right? An entrepreneurial family, right? That's innovative, that's paying taxes, that's creating jobs. Another one leaving, right? And I'm like, why does this keep happening? And these are the questions that we need to ask ourselves. And part of the article goes, Australia will always be home, but it's no longer where we're meant to grow and raise our children. Because when you're taxed to the eyeballs, no matter how much you make or write off, slammed by the rising cost of living, no matter what state you live in, crushed by the weight of tall poppy syndrome, and this isn't just taxes, right? Crushed by the weight of tall poppy syndrome, if you dare to dream bigger, seeing policies and laws change faster than you can adapt, watching our city struggle to keep up with decisions we didn't vote for, watching systems shape your kids in ways you didn't choose, and watching opportunity for entrepreneurs to get smaller, not greater. You realize you can either stay silent and conform or do what's best and make a move. And we chose to make a move like that. There's some powerful insights in here, right? Put the tax, put that rubbish right away for a second. And just like, if you dare to dream bigger, seeing policies and laws change faster than you can adapt, watching our city struggle, right? Like watching systems shape our kids in the ways we didn't choose. Like those are deep comments.
And this is what I'm currently torn with, right? Because I was just saying to Dom, we've got an hour drive to get in. We're talking about standard of living, quality of life, and we're just saying this is the best time in history to be alive. There are so many exciting great things happening. Like I'd love to go back and visit other eras, but this is the era that I want to be in, and I want to see the next 40 years unfold, right? But on the same token, right, in the same day, I can sometimes resonate with that article and that feeling that I feel like is just permeating through everyone's front of mind.
I'd be keen to hear Ross's take on
Yeah.
that snippet of that article, with that degradation of what we're talking about as the main theme of the pod.
Yeah. Well, look, it's difficult because there is this, propensity of the so-called "we'll all be ruined" mentality, that we all know of that personality who just constantly is doom, expecting the worst, Armageddon scenarios, but and there is a human vulnerability to this way of defeatist thinking, and it can be attractive because it can excuse people of responsibility for their own issues. But let's be honest and say I'm very, sympathetic to the podcast's problem, because I think we have to admit Australia is in rapid decline. Rapid. We are destroying the joint. And we inherited this most extraordinary continent, in effect, to ourselves, with the Indigenous and the European arrivals. We had a whole continent to ourselves, blessed with the most extraordinarily abundant natural resources. In, 40% of the world's uranium in a hole in the ground at Roxby Down. Massive supply of liquid natural gas. We've got another 200-300 years worth of coking coal. Even just in Queensland, while the Liberal Party watches the industry destroyed by its world's highest, ever royalty taxes. Anyway, abundant resources, beautiful coastline, and it seems almost like the thing is too good to be able to destroy, but we are making a very bloody good job of it. And I think, we have to admit that. And if the podcast wishes to be grounded in reality, we cannot pretend we're somewhere other than where we are. And we are not just in a state of decline, but that decline is getting more rapid. It's the speed of decline, which is shocking. You look at the rate at which the Commonwealth has created debt.
Yeah, it's.
If you look at
I think it all comes back to debt. It all comes back to the debt.
Yeah. The speed of debt creation, combine that with the speed of fertility decline. So we're now down to around 1.5. 1.5 is just an obvious suicide note. We're saying our culture is dead, and it's really an argument over what replaces it and over what period of time. And, I see these guys saying, we've got to go somewhere else. I know you guys have got some expertise in property development, residential subdivisions, building assets. I say it is now absolutely rational for an Australian to be looking for a fallback position somewhere else.
It's a sad indictment, isn't it?
And is it something that we can overcome? Right here in Australia, can we overcome this Western world problem? Because this is a Western world problem, declining birth rates and debt, potential for sovereign debt crisis, etc. Can we overcome it here in Australia, which has historically been the lucky country, shielded from all these issues? Like during 2008, we actually had a boom off the back of China. Or is the global debt cycle coming towards its end just too much for us to overcome? What are the steps here in Australia, if you were in power, that we could overcome it with? Or what can we do as individuals listening to shield ourselves from this debt problem that is facing the West, that will not be able to be sidestepped here anymore?
Well, Aristotle said that in the rhetoric, he said deliberative rhetoric begins with scope limitation to what is achievable, to things that are within our influence and control. And he says that's the highest and most valuable form of rhetoric, is discussing those things that affect the whole of the tribe, like war, taxes, legislation, but within a rubric of what is really achievable. And I think this is the most important question in a way. I give Australia a 5% chance of recovery. I think 5% is realistic. It's not nothing, it means it's unlikely, but it's not impossible. There is, I think, a realistic scenario in which it might be done, but it would require very, very significant change. And the reason I say that the 95% unlikely is I don't at the moment see the trigger for change.
Pain.
I don't, and that's right. And many others who I respect
Enough pain.
say to me, it'll have to get a lot worse before it gets better. And then I just think, well, there's a point from which you can't come back. There's a point. And if, for example, you go ahead and say, okay, Australia is going to import 1 million migrants from India, okay, over 24 months. Modi and Albo, backslapping, blah, blah. There's a sense in which I have to accept Albo has a problem because the Australian male no longer finds the Australian female interesting, attractive, or safe enough to say, can I buy you a drink? Or to have a conversation at a bus stop out of fear, But putting that to one side, what you would have to do is, if I were in charge, I would cancel the AUKUS $360 billion for 12 submarines, each of which can be destroyed by a $2,000 drone in about 10 minutes. I'd cancel AUKUS. I would immediately withdraw from the Paris Agreement. I would end all green subsidies. I would completely remove the Department of the Environment and Climate Change. I would abolish the Federal Department of Education. I would return taxing powers to the states. I would seek, however, I would abolish capital gains tax. I would abolish all taxes on commercial transactions. I would seek to reduce, instead of saying, we have to set tax rates to fit the size of the government, I would fit the size of the government I say if a person is giving 10% of their wealth to the government, I could live with it. If the state, local, state and federal currently represents about 40% of GDP as a money laundering wash operation, I would seek to reduce that to below 10%. I would go into, and a range of people won't like this bit of it, but I would embrace China. I think that, as you mentioned, we avoided the so-called global financial crisis purely because of Chinese demand. And when you've got this rapidly still rising middle class of several 100 million people in our region wanting to buy the things that we're capable of selling, Aristotle says that anything done with reluctance is difficult. And I just say, we either should go to war with China or we should make love to China. And I prefer to make love. And I say China has been an extraordinary blessing to Australia over the last 4 decades. If China turned off the tap of consumption of Australian product tomorrow, we would be completely stuffed. And so I say, lean in. We should be part of the Belt and Road. We should let the Chinese build us a high-speed rail between Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra and Melbourne. Maybe South Australia. We should allow the private sector to do some major infrastructure projects, in particular in relation to water. I mean, if the joint is 70% desert, it was 70% desert when we arrived in 1788, and it's 70% desert today. I can promise you this, if the Jews were running Australia, it would not be 70% desert, And if the Chinese were running Australia, it would not be 70% desert.
Wow.
We need to, and we know that at different periods in Earth's geological history, there's been huge amounts of water in the interior of Australia. Vast, what do we call it? Gondwana. I mean, vast. We've got marine mammal fossils in the Tanami Desert.
Have you ever read the books Dune, or ever seen the movie Dune, or the science fiction? I'm struck by how much science fiction is actually true
Yeah.
these days. Like,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Well, I was learning last night about a guy from who drove the freshwater pipeline. One Irish Catholic engineer in Western Australia put water to Kalgoorlie, which had gold but no water. Was sort of persecuted by the Protestant sort of in-family clique. But we could do so much more with this continent. We would capture and harvest well under 1% of the fresh water that falls on Australia. I would dredge the river systems. We've got rivers all over this country which are navigable by marine, commercial and tourism transport, which should be, but no longer are because they're silted up. And the Greens have all said, well, you can't dredge them. Well, I say, I'm sorry, we're dredging the river mouth. We're going to make sure we're going to restore Australian shipping and maritime trade. We have to say, you guys know a bit about property development. I mean, the amount of time, I was talking to a guy about a significant new development, $50 million property, and I say, what are your costs? And he's sort of pricing the deal. And he says, oh, well, I've got $500,000 in the financial model because I know when we submit our plan, the council will reject it, and then we'll take the council to the Land and Environment Court. It'll cost us $500,000, and then 12 months later, we'll get a floor plan we can live with. But that's just that $500,000, and the $500,000 is significantly less than the cash cost of servicing the debt for the extra 12 months on a $50 million acquisition. So these are purely discretionary costs imposed on the private sector by the state, and I would go through them ruthlessly.
So it sounds like we've got an Elon Musk for Australia on our hands with Doge. Wants to go through and cut and burn, which is great. He one of the richest guys and smartest guys on the planet, worked out he couldn't defeat the two main parties over there. So in a situation that you're in, what hope have we got? Like, you're one man, you're in the Libertarian Party. We've got the two major parties, as we heard from Shumla the other day, two cheeks in the same ass. Nothing's going to change. At what point does it get to the point where it completely falls to shit and someone like yourself gets the opportunity to come in and fix it with the slash and burn or an Argentinian sort of model? Because if we haven't had enough pain yet, it's going to be a fucking long road until we have had.
Yeah.
And what do we do? What do we do until
in between now and then?
Can't fix it?
Go live in Greece.
There is an American historian whom I love and whom I would really recommend to your audience because he's very accessible. He wrote really for teenagers, and his name is Jacob Abbott, Abbott. And Jacob Abbott is interesting in part because he was Abraham Lincoln's favourite historian, and he's very, very readable. And he makes this observation about human beings in his biography of Nero, which I was going to read to you if I can find it, but I probably can't. But what he says is, here we go. He's talking about, he says, it's very, very difficult to establish authority, sustainable authority. But once established, it's extraordinary how willingly human beings will continue to submit to that authority, even when it's clearly hopelessly dysfunctional and corrupt. And since Eric, I think, read I'm done, I'm going to give you Jacob Abbott on this question in his biography of Nero. He says, it required great genius in the commanders to bring up the army to this position of ascendancy and power. But once up, it sustained itself there without the necessity of ability of any kind or of any lofty qualities whatever in those subsequently placed at the head. In fact, the reader of history has often occasion to be perfectly amazed at the lengths to which human endurance will go when a governmental power of any kind is once established in tolerating imbecility and folly in the individual representatives of it. It seems to be immaterial whether the dominant power assumes the form of a dynasty of kings, a class of hereditary nobles, a line of military generals, or we might say an Australian democracy, so-called. He says, no degree of stupidity, folly, or crime, once instated, will exhaust the spirit of submission with which man always bows to established power. And, you know, we can see after the sort of authoritarian, brutalist regime of the COVID lockdowns and mandatory injection of experimental drugs, you would have thought this might be, people might have woken up and said, look, maybe these guys are not on our side, right?
Yeah, they voted Dan Andrews in with
back
the
in. Back in.
fucking
They gave him more.
majority.
The answer to your question, I think, is blackouts.
When power goes
Yeah,
out,
yeah,
which is coming.
yeah. Once the eastern seaboard goes black, whether it happens at the height of summer or the peak of winter, once people are shivering under a rug, you know, trying to start up a kerosene lamp, once they lose access to, you know, the internet, the communications network, I think blackouts is the most plausible trigger. But it's essentially a race as to whether the virus, the mental illness of net zero destroys the host first, or whether we can, you know, destroy the virus of net zero. And this race is taking place at the moment, net zero in Australia. Elsewhere, it's a different story, but in Australia, the virus is winning.
I knew there was I mean, I definitely believe this. That's why I've got a Tesla Powerwall and Starlink. Because I think it's coming.
Yeah.
Seven out of the 10 major grids in the US have already raised concern that they don't think their grids can handle like the excess load.
Yeah.
And I think with AI, the biggest restriction on AI is not compute, it's power.
No, I mean, the power for the compute.
The power.
Yeah.
And so, and this is the war, World War III, whatever you want to call it. This is the war that's taking place at the moment, that war for power to control the AI. Because like you said, a $2,000 drone can defeat billions of dollars of heavy artillery and technology.
The combination
And you need connectivity.
of power demand from AI, crypto mining, and the driverless vehicle is massive.
I've read some scary statistics on what's going to be required, and it's so much more than what we're currently using today.
This, I think, has to be, you asked the question earlier, Mark, about is it in relation to sterility and the declining birth rate and the desire to put landmines and to fill the air with accusations of misconduct and to lavishly and constantly report them as if they are the only news, indeed, as if they are news. And just to kill the mood, right, to destroy the chance of any sort of natural mammalian attraction and interaction. Is it deliberate? And you know, I think we have to come to the view that
As a distraction.
that it is, there is a deliberate campaign to promote any policy that produces death or sterility, whether it's abortion, euthanasia, mandatory injection of untested experimental warp speed drugs, or you know, the killing of the punishment, if you like, of clumsy expressions of interest between the genders, the desire to completely sterilize the workplace, all of that agenda feeds into, I see it like the antlion's trap. The antlion is the ant that builds a conical sand trap. If you think of the upside down cone and made of sand, and it just barely holds together, but the angle of alignment of the sand is such that once the insect passing by steps over, it falls into the trap and the sand collapses into the predator at the bottom who eats and destroys it. And all of these policies work together like the antlion's trap.
And are the leaders like meeting in a back room somewhere? And I know you might not even be able to answer this, but is it like the Illuminati, or is it the leaders meeting in a back room, or is it this subconscious virus that has infected them as well to make them just keep towing that line? Like what? Who's leading this?
Yeah. Well, this is a great and very interesting question. And, one can trying to figure this out. It is possible to go a bit nuts if you think about it for too long.
Yeah.
But I'm happy to give you...
Follow the money trail?
Yeah. I say start with the money. And what happened was, there's a guy named, you may be familiar with Eckhart Tolle.
Mm-hmm.
And Eckhart was basically rewriting ancient Stoicism, but the power of now, which made him a celebrity. And then he went on Oprah, and he just went from a homeless guy to a global celebrity like that because of a well-articulated short book. And he was asked, are you going to form a Eckhart kind of institute? Because there's so much interest, are you going to teach this? Are you going to create Eckhart University? And he said, no, I've thought about it and I'm not. And he said, the reason is because anytime you create an institution, there is always a very significant risk, almost inevitably, over time the institution becomes self-serving. And it kind of breaks away from its moorings of serving the thing it was created to do and begins to serve itself. And this is what's happened with the so-called democratic state. The state was created as a sort of a necessary evil to enforce private property rights, to ensure there was justice in the courts, and to protect the nation from foreign invasion. But over time, the state realized it enjoyed two monopolies. One was a monopoly on the use of force, and secondly, was related a monopoly in printing money, raising cash, printing money. And so the state realized this was actually two extraordinarily powerful privileges. And so then what the state did was the state went to a number of other big actors in the economy and said, look, we're actually more interested in the state's interest than the citizens' interest. And so they went to the big corporations, to kind of Apple and Microsoft and Google and, the tech bros, and said, look, why don't we do a deal? And we'll kind of look after your interests if you will just mirror back to your customer base our daft, woke, statist, big state policies, like the sterility agenda, like anti-racism, like climate change, blah, blah, blah. And if we all get together and pretend that this is normal human behavior, the punters will suck it up.
So is it basically, with the advance of technology, the state trying to protect themselves against the rise of the sovereign individual?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, we can go back to John Stuart Mill, who said the central portions of history, the most consistent theme is the battle between liberty and authority. And it's really insiders and outsiders, and there is an commercial insider racket taking place. And it's what I would call the NGO industrial sector, the military industrial arms complex. It's the multilateral agencies like the World Health Organization, the United Nations, the Asian Development Bank, blah, blah, blah. It's the 3 or 4 major global owners of listed equities, State Street, BlackRock, Vanguard. It's the tech bros up until Elon revolted.
Peter Thiel.
And yeah, and these guys got together and they basically said, so for example, if you just take, I don't want to go on and on about COVID, but I mean, at the peak of the COVID hysteria, I would call state-sponsored terrorism, between the Commonwealth Department of Health, New South Wales Department of Health, Victoria, they were spending $50 million a month advertising COVID fear porn. So you could not turn on the radio or a television without getting smashed of there has been an outbreak at the Bunnings, Broadmeadow, and a whole suburb in panic, but the government was paying $50 million a month to get to advertise COVID fear. And so, we libertarians wanted to send a candidate onto Sky News in the lead up to the election. And, the producer of Sky News says, just understand, if you mention one thing about the vaccine, you'll never be invited on Sky News ever again. And there was this blanket hegemonic, and this is the deal. And all I'm saying is that deal is taking place. If you look in, say, Victorian newspapers, there's like 20 Victorian, long-standing mastheads of Victorian, the Riverlands, Orchard Bugle, or, of newspaper titles, struggling as newspapers around the world, their revenue model was declining. So then the Victorian government under Dan Andrews just goes and said, okay, well, we will buy a full-page ad in every Victorian regional and rural newspaper every week as a pure subsidy because of our concern for diversity in media. Okay, so you can imagine the editor of that paper, he knows his single best advertising customer is Daniel Andrews. And so then when Daniel Andrews says, we want to lock down a city for 2 years, how do you boys feel about it? Right? They're kind of looking at the bottom line, looking at their client list. So, Dan, we think that might be quite a good idea. Why don't we lock down the whole state for a couple of years? It's a collusive relationship.
So you've just mentioned this and articulated it quite well. My most important question is, does Bitcoin fix this?
Well, you boys know more about crypto world than I do. But I will say to you that whatever, the magic of crypto is this distributed ledger. In terms of the political, it's the fact that the platform is not owned by Tech Bro, right? It is a genuinely kind of democratic payment institution platform, and it's one of the reasons why it's been so vigorously resisted. I think it was it Diamond, who was the JP Morgan guy who came out and said it was a Ponzi. And so what happens was that you get this this evolution of the idea taking place, where first they say it's it's absolutely ridiculous, stupid, corrupt, whatever, and then they say it's when it continues to get traction, there's a sort of a second phase where they say something like, oh well,
first they ignore you, then they try and tear you down,
and then they say it was my idea in the first place, or then they produce a government-owned crypto. And I understand this piece of legislation, which has just gone through the US Congress last night, which sort of lays the foundation for a US government-backed crypto. And there's a lot of, apprehension about it. But I say, crypto, I think, the banking cartel is absolutely central to the deep state. And I know your guest last week, in your last episode, was your South African legal academic, I forget his name.
Andy
Shomolo was saying, why is it that the 4 Australian banks have got the highest return on equity of any banks in the world? And the reason is because the governments and the banks are essentially government departments, right? They're arms of the executive government. And the government says, okay, well, we're going to go ahead and build a regulatory moat around you, Big Four, so that nobody else can possibly get in and compete with you, right? And we're going to make it an incredibly complex regulatory mode. And you would think the banks hate the complexity of regulation, but actually they love it because it keeps all the other bastards out. And, these guys, then the government says, all right, we want to mandate a woke agenda on anti-racism, okay? And the banks realise they actually only have one customer, and it's not you or me. It's the regulator is their only customer. And it doesn't matter how badly behaved an Australian bank is. They may recruit payments from 30,000 dead people for years. They'll never lose their banking license, okay, because those four are part of the infrastructure of the state. And in exchange for favours and backstretching and regulatory protection from APRA, from ASIC, from the Treasury, from the Reserve Bank, it's you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. And so the Australian economy is not really an economy. It's really the rum core, just 225 years later.
And that's what I think. Like for people out there watching, I mean, we've done a lot of these podcasts, spoken to a lot of different people. We've done a lot of reading, and I think being able to, in some way, and this is not advice, but in some way be able to control your own property, all right, however it is, and the ultimate we need people out there that are ultimately truth seeking. And this is why I'm such a fan of Elon Musk, because I think whether you love him, hate him, whether you think he's trying to take over the world or not, probably is, right? He's trying to create, what he's trying to create with XAI is ultimately truth seeking. So that, I mean, that's the most important thing. You want to be able to get to the truth of all these things that we're talking about.
I want to finish off the podcast by, I guess, if you rewind and take yourself back to, your 30, 40-year-old self, family or no family, married or not married, and you put yourself now in that person's shoes today in Australia, because a lot has happened in that time. Not calling you old, but what advice would you give these people? Because those are the majority of people that listen to this podcast, and we always talk about the issues and the problems, and everyone has their opinion on how to fix it. But if you were to give them some advice, some life advice on what to do, because a lot of them are in situations where they're stuck, right? They are literally living week by week, trying to put food on the table, and they are, living there in that victim mentality, right? And feel like they're stuck, like you mentioned earlier. What would you say to them?
Oh, well, I'd say firstly, you're listening to a, pretty flawed bloke whose advice mainly comes from the mistakes that he made. But I think it's a very good question to ask of an older person. And indeed, we're crazy not to more often take advantage of that perspective. But I would say, number one, you should plan, you should plan to marry and have children, whether you're male or female. You should plan to marry once. You should, the best way to ensure, the single biggest cause of relationship breakdown is financial stress. And a great deal can be solved by a significant cash surplus. You should aim to accumulate income generating assets. You should aim to reach a point in your life relatively quickly where you are living with very little or no debt. The moment you are in debt, in particular, you should avoid as much as you can being indebted to an Australian bank. So as soon as you are indebted to an Australian bank, you are hostage to the bank's agenda. And the Australian bank is not a simple financial institution. The Australian bank is an branch of the executive government, enforcing executive government policy. And even if you hold cash with an Australian bank and go to take it out, a 26-year-old bank teller down the front will look at you and say, why do you need that $5,000? Now, the answer to that question is it is none of your business, okay, but it's an indication of the coils of the anaconda wrapping tighter and tighter. I would say to you that in a really, in the luxury world, you should aim to own assets and hold cash in a second jurisdiction outside of Australia. You should aim to hold assets which have, a reasonably high degree of liquidity. You should work fairly hard to maintain a degree of privacy, which is increasingly going to be a luxury of the rich. The role of facial recognition is just going to get greater and greater, faster and faster, and your whole world is going to be mapped by, from your watch to walking into. It'll start very often when the government wants to do something which is unpleasant, and indeed, I would say immoral. They get the corporations in the mates club to roll it out first. So they're not actually the ones doing it. But once, Telstra or once Woolworths says, we're going to identify you by your iris, okay, it's pretty much game over. And I expect, no, but there'll be, so anyway, I would be there. I say educate do not trust state-funded education for your children. And Plutarch, and by that I mean state and public, quote, public and private schools. There's only one school in New South Wales which has received zero government funding. But the point is, as soon as you take the money, you're implicated in the agenda. And so I think we are reaching a point where it's almost an act of negligence for an Australian parent to leave their child in an Australian school.
I've got a 2.5-year-old, and people always say, "Oh, you're not going to be able to do this. You're not going to be able," when they're at school, and we're increasingly just hesitant and unsure about wanting to send them to any school within Australia. Like, and we don't necessarily want to homeschool, but we're thinking international schools for stints. We're thinking like creating a community school. I'd love to take my kid to Ad Astra, the school, Elon Musk's school, in Austin. But it's like we're moving into a world that's changing very, very rapidly, and I think the people that are going to survive that world are the ones that haven't been indoctrinated into this shit, right?
To have your children be able to think critically.
Yeah, that's right.
It's just an absolute essential. Plutarch, who, if you're interested or getting interested in the ancient world, Plutarch is a great place to start because he's very, very readable. And you can read him today and he's fresh off the page. He was a priest at the Temple of Delphi, but a Greek who wrote biographies of the 50 sort of greatest Greeks and Romans, and they're called the Parallel Lives. But he also wrote a series of essays, which is called Plutarch's Moralia, and one of them was on the education of children. He made the observation, he said, "I'm often astonished at my wealthy friends who take so much care of their cellar, and they carefully select a sort of, sommelier to advise them on the accumulation of wine, but they will entrust the education of their child to the latest passing buffoon."
It's more than the education. They're outsourcing the bloody looking after of their child, from after school care to nannies to the works.
Yeah.
The parenting.
I would say that one of the highest luxuries, if you can have a wife and mother who is a full-time executive of the family, that's luxury. That's where you want to be.
I'm a luxurious, blessed.
I am blessed, and so is Mark.
Yeah.
James has decided not to go down that rabbit hole. And I mean, everyone to themselves, right? Everyone needs to make that decision. But there's a few ticks on those comments.
That's
that
it's
you
just
made
great.
earlier, and some great advice.
Great to hear it.
And I just want to say, First of all, thank you. And it's a reminder, and I want to do a little precursor to this podcast so people don't get lost in that first 30 to 40 minutes of history, because people will get lost. And then and I'm one of them, and I didn't get lost. I was listening, but what I'm saying is I'm one of them that all the research that I do is kind of for the future. And not enough of us are doing research of the actual past. And I realize when we have these high level intellects come in, especially around politics, you guys are very, very seasoned with history. And it reminds me how much I'm not. I don't know how you guys feel.
I mean, there's analogies. You can only join the dots by looking in the revision mirror, right?
Yeah.
It's like up until a certain age, Eric, we're focused on survival or building, and so we're forced to be in the future. But then once I feel like now, like once I'm getting to a period of, I'm getting now to that period where I've just bought those 11 volumes of Will Durant, and I'm gonna like read them every night. Like but it's kind of that thing that happens with time. It's very rare to find a 20-year-old that wants to study history.
I agree. So I want to say thank you for making the trip up here from New South Wales. As literally, I think you've just arrived because your luggage is in our foyer at the moment. And thanks again, James and Mark, for being on here, because I think these are very, very important conversations to be had. And you've given some great advice, and thank you very much for spending the time in talking to our audience, because I think we all need to do more of what you're saying. And for those of you guys that are listening, if you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, please share, please comment. Let us know what you liked. Let us know what you disliked. And we will continue to add value around these topics and discussions. And we'll see you on the next one. Thank you.
Hey there. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Unemployable. If you'd like to watch another episode, just click there.